these great faces. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Good afternoon. My name is Krista Van Hove, and I am campus planner at Stanford and president of the Northern California chapter ASLA. On behalf of the chapter, thank you for joining our speaker series today, Lunch with Leaders, Industry Icons. A few housekeeping notes. If you're comfortable, please turn on your camera. It'd be great to see everybody. For those of you who want to know who is on our executive committee, you'll see ASLA NCC by their name. So if you have any questions or want to get involved with our chapter, feel free to reach out to any one of us. And last, please utilize the chat function within Zoom to send any questions you might have during the presentation. We have a special announcement for you all today. We have our speaker series lineup for the next 6 months that we would like to announce. Our team has worked very hard to bring you some of landscape architecture's finest, and we are so excited to have you join our chapter alongside these inspiring people for the rest of this year. We will be welcoming, in addition to Charles today, we have Andrea Cochran, Mia Lair, Michael Boland, April Phillips, and David Walker. This lecture series has been going on since summer of 2020, so if you've missed any of our past lectures, you can find the recordings on our chapter website or our YouTube channel. One last announcement before we turn the mic over today. Our chapter elections will start next week, so please keep an eye out on your email announcements from our wonderful Laura, so you can help us vote in our executive committee members for next year. Now I would like to formally introduce you to Charles A. Birnbaum. He is the president, CEO, and founder of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, TCLF. Prior to creating TCLF, he spent 15 years as the coordinator of the National Park Service Historic Landscape Initiative, HLI, and a decade in private practice in New York City, with a focus on landscape preservation and urban design. Since taking the helm at the foundation in 2008, his major projects include the web-based initiative, What's Out There Weekend, a searchable database of the nation's designed landscape heritage, and the creation of the first international prize in landscape architecture named for Cornelia Hand Oberlander. He has authored and edited numerous publications, including Shaping the Post-War Landscape, the Modern Landscapes Transition and Transformation Series, Shaping the American Landscape, Design with Culture, Claiming America's Landscape Heritage, Preserving Modern Landscape Architectures, and its follow-up publication, Making Post-War Landscapes Visible, Pioneers of American Landscape Design, and the Guidelines for Treatment of Cultural Landscapes. In 1995, the American Society of Landscape Architects awarded the HLI the President's Award of Excellence. In '96, the ASLA inducted him as fellow into the society. He served as a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, during which time he founded the TCLF. In 2004, he was awarded the Rome Prize in Historic Preservation and Conservation and spent the spring and summer of that year in the American Academy in Rome. In '08, he was visiting Glimcher Distinguished Professor at Ohio State University, Austin E. Knowlton School of Architecture. That same year, the ASLA awarded him the Alfred B. Lagasse Medal, followed by the President's Medal in '09. In 2017, he received the ASLA Society's ASLA Medal, the Society's highest award. He has served as visiting professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, a visiting critic at Harvard's GSD, and currently serves as a lecturer in landscape architecture at Harvard GSD. He has also been a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post from 2011 to 2018. And in 2020, he received the Lanzine International Landscape Honor Award. And as well as the Garden Club of America's Historic Preservation Medal. Whew, I hope I got all of that right. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And on behalf of the chapter, please welcome Charles.
Thanks, Krista. I will go to my images in a couple of moments, but I just want to enjoy seeing a lot of familiar names and familiar faces. It's really great. Obviously not traveling to the West Coast recently to see a number of people like Doug and Sarah, one of my Charlie's Angels, and Michael Boland. It really feels like old home week. So it's wonderful to see everyone. Todd and Krista, thanks for making this such a welcoming opportunity. What I'd like to do today is I've got about sort of 22 minutes of images. And really what I want people to do personally as they look at the images that I'm going to sort of whiplash your way through is to think about how you measure success in your own work. I see the majority of people here are landscape architects or stewards. And one of the things that I'm always curious about, in particular in my teaching, is really trying to understand what are the lenses in which we measure success. And do we put nature on the same footing as culture and history on historic systems on the same footing as ecological systems? I think right now we're at a place where I think the traditional practice of applying National Register criteria solely to the works of masters or things that are less than 50 years old, how do we respond to that as landscape architects in our work? Managing change, placemaking, a term that a lot of people like to use. How do we approach sites that in just the last year and a half have experienced trauma and transition as we have? How do we reconcile that as landscape architects? So with that, I'm going to give you sort of a cross-section of things that I'm thinking about. I've put in a couple of very recent sort of hot potatoes, and I'm assuming that everyone can see my screen. Krista, I can see you. Can you just nod for me that it's great? Okay, so then I'm going to minimize these cells. I wanted to open with something. This is on the homepage of our website at tclf.org. This is Rockefeller Park. It is the work of Emma van Sweden and a cadre of other landscape architects and artists that were involved through the work of the Battery Park City Authority. In the last couple of weeks, this has been the subject of controversy because Governor Cuomo has proposed plopping a $3 million memorial to essential workers right in the middle of this masterpiece of landscape architecture. I thought, knowing that I'm going to be speaking to the Northern California chapter, although I didn't know that Michael would be with us today and he's in the same series, I'm delighted that I have this image from the Presidio, one of the many projects that have taken place over the last several decades. And I wanted to open with the idea that as landscape architects, we often have the good fortune of working shoulder to shoulder with the work of others. And the reason why I think the dilemma we have with Battery Park City is no different than the recent dilemma with the remaking of M. Paul Friedberg's Pershing Park on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., that in all three of these cases, the Battery Park City Authority, Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, and the Presidio, there was a framework. There was a shared design vocabulary. There were shared stewardship values for management and interpretation that were overarching and seamless through all of that project work. So what happens when you have something that is proposed that's just plopped into the middle of open space because it's there? And what happens when there is no, in this particular case, there was no public process. And after this park became a problem just this past week, the governor of New York came back with two alternatives where literally this memorial was treated as a kit of parts. This is sort of heartbreaking. This is actually next to the Irish Famine Memorial. And here it is plopped into an area of celebrated volleyball courts. I'm happy to report that as of just hours ago, the mayor has pulled this project, pardon me, the governor has pulled this project back. And so how do you measure success? Is it acceptable to just put things like this in landscapes that were created as a comprehensive vision. Now, in talking to Todd and preparing today, Todd raised Levi's to me, and I was saying that I used to go to Il Fornaio, which is here on the right, and have hot fudge sundaes with Larry Halprin. And you can see the difference between the plant material, the sculptural plant material that Halprin had proposed, and you see on the right some of the more recent plantings in this little memorial placard that has been introduced. Unquestionably, a landscape that is a seminal work for Halprin in the Bay Area, incredibly well maintained for many years by the Levi's Corporation, and clearly National Register eligible. But how do you measure success? When you're a student and you're coming in with a project, what's the criteria that underpins your approach to any given project? Now, in other disciplines or in other activities such as sports, measuring success is pretty straightforward. The same could be said for tree huggers. When it comes to green building standards, there is clear metrics, and landscape performance has done much to move that from building architecture to landscape architecture. But what about historic and cultural systems? How do we quantify those metrics? These are photographs that I actually took of Prospect Park in 1984. And we can see here that if we were to approach this from a historic preservation perspective, that this would be characterized as having had poor condition and diminished or low integrity. We can also see how parts of the park have been transformed over time where they were diminished, where there had been a cinder block skating rink put in during the Robert Moses era that was transformed by Todd Williams and Billy Tsine, working in partnership with the Prospect Park Alliance. Part of this work not only recaptured the Lakeside Pavilion in the former Concert Grove, but it actually restored and reconstructed lost landscape features. So the bone structure of that landscape, if you will, guided how change were to happen. That is how success was measured. And in projects like the High Line, again, we can understand the value of the authentic fabric that had survived, that individual rails, were actually marked and put into storage and then came back in their original locations as part of the new planting renewals. But how do we balance complicated resources that have shifting values of natural and cultural resources? Probably more pronounced where you guys are on your coast than where I am in terms of the scale of the challenge. And one of the questions that I often ask is, especially of students, in terms of who do you identify with? When you look around and look at other practitioners, do you put yourself in one of these silos, or do you approach landscapes holistically with a series of shared values? This was part of the reason I created the Cultural Landscape Foundation while I was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design in 97, 98, to be, if you will, a silo buster. All of the work that we do is driven by an understanding of context, and this is something I'll come back to several times in the next minutes, context being both historical and physical. It recognizes, of course, that cultural landscapes give us a sense of place. They reveal our relationship with the land over time. They're part of our heritage, part of each of our lives. When we look at this particular space, how do we value the expression of the Valancourt fountain? The fact that it was conceived during an era of urban renewal in response to the freeway that is no more. The fact that it is a work by Halprin. The fact that it's probably the only largely intact urban post-war modernist piazza in America. How does that funnel into how we manage change? Our mission, quite simply, is to connect people to places. And we do this with three lenses: make visible, instill value, and engage the public in the work that we're doing. Very much a bottom-up approach. We're a non-membership organization. Anyone can sign up for our e-letters on our webpage. We'll send you one every other week. and the majority of the resources that we produce are available to the public for free. There are 4 primary programs. Krista mentioned our most recent, which is the Cornelia Hahn Obelander International Prize in Landscape Architecture. And we will actually recognize our first laureate this fall, and that will be followed by 2 years of public programming. And as the text notes, there is a $100,000 purse here, the same as the Pritzker Prize, the same as the Nasher Sculpture Prize. Our 3 core programs: What's Out There, a database now with over 2,100 sites. I know a number of you participated in our What's Out There weekend in San Francisco a couple of years ago. Our Pioneer series, both written projects and oral histories. I should mention that the next one that we'll be unveiling in the next 2 months is for landscape architect Pamela Burton of Santa Monica, California. And then finally, Landslide, our at-risk program, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. Here's our database. One of the things that was really interesting to me during COVID is we went from about 1.2 million views to 2.3 million. Clearly, people want to get outdoors. They're looking for landscapes that are publicly accessible. And because many of our sites come up very high in Google searches, we had a great surge in web traffic during the COVID crisis. In terms of something more substantive, and I was asking everyone how they measure success, I thought that I would just sort of note that the way that I approach a landscape, a cultural landscape, if you will, is 4 C's. I've already told you context on the right, which is physical and historical. I think of features, buildings as containers or features in the landscape, so as contributing elements. Community, those that live, work, play. And then finally, collections. And those collections can be non-living or living collections. This is a Royston landscape in Palo Alto on the left. The question I want to ask people, though, also is, what is the cultural value of landscape architecture? How do we begin to move beyond the traditional themes and concepts that have been defined by the historic preservation community to think about the dynamics inherent in a performative landscape associated with a present day culture? How do we move beyond the icons when we're managing change? Over the last several years, the foundation has been focusing on many landscapes associated with different cultural lifeways through our landslide theme. For example, in 2018, our Grounds for Democracy compendium focused on those places that remind us of who we are and the lessons we can never forget. Representative sites included Japanese internment camps, sites of former lynching trees, and how those sites play out today. These 2 sites on the right are in Shelby County, Tennessee. But what do you do when you have a site that has become a 7-Eleven, has become a gas station? What can we do as landscape architects to make visible this larger narrative as a tool for healing and reconciliation? This past year, we decided to take on the sort of 100 years of women and the discipline. For me, it was pretty eye-opening to see a number of trends and patterns. For example, a great number of the women who we were celebrating, like Ruth Shellhorn, shown here with Walt Disney. She was the landscape architect of all of the Bullock's department stores and of Disneyland. Her husband worked for her. She never had children. And one of the things we found is that many of these women, if they didn't marry, they rarely had children. And if they had children like Beatrix Ferrand, they didn't, or Susan Child, they actually didn't begin practicing until the kids went off to school. We also discovered that in the discipline today, as we try to capture landscapes that we could bring higher visibility to, we were hard pressed to find landscapes designed by women of color before the 70s. The one exception was the Ann Spencer Garden, the Harlem Renaissance poet, and her granddaughter, Shawn Spencer Hester, who is in the garden today as the curator and runs the organization. Sarah Zudi told us that only 0.02% of the discipline are women of color. And that many of these landscapes quite often are disappearing and dying quiet deaths. In the case of Clermont-Lee's landscapes in Savannah, Georgia, for example, we advocated, sadly, unsuccessfully, to protect her most important landscape that she designed for the Girl Scouts of America over a 40-year period. In the past year, it's been paved over and turned into an event space at the Juliet Gordon Low birth home. Much work needs to be done by the discipline to safeguard the legacy of the trailblazing women that came before us. But the other question that I have, and this is just a 10-minute walk from where I live in Washington, D.C., is there are spaces that have taken on such significance in the last 2 years. And I would say that if you consider the way in which the Park Service defines a historic site, because of its associations with individual persons and events, that these places pass that test. What will we do in managing change? You know, I remember the day on that Saturday when it was announced that Biden had been announced as the winner and president. I walked down to Black Lives Matter Plaza. And I have to tell you guys that every time I show this clip, every time I show this clip, I get such an emotional surge from that day. What can we do when we look at opening this street? Well, we'll recognize that 21st century life played out in such a way during that period of time. Now, in some cases, it's exciting to see there are cities that are leading this charge. In the district, if you will, where George Floyd was slain, the city has been working on a variety of community-based engagements with outside artists. And the question that I want to ask all of you to think about as landscape architects when measuring success is how can we actually look at place from the perspective of authenticity? How can we harness the physical fabric, what's there in the 4 C's that I mentioned, the context, the building envelope, the views in different locations, the way in which the sun might hit the street? All of that has integrity of setting and power of place. And my concern right now in the discipline is that we move beyond plopping down text and sign panels to tell the story and bringing in outside artists as opposed to work with the community to put something down on a site. What role can landscape architects play through harnessing the authenticity of place through design, through doing what we do as landscape architects? How do we daylight and reveal and harness the integrity and authenticity of these places to tell a story? You might call it realness. It has a value. Think about going to the World Trade Center site. Every time I have gone back since my initial visits, the queue of people waiting to be photographed in front of the one survivor tree, the witness tree, the Bradford pear, and its beautifully restrained tree guard designed by Peter Walker and Partners office. It'll take a half hour to have your picture taken. This to me is where landscape architects have opportunities with here again, our 4 C's, our collections, our living collections. This is the Hermitage, for example. And the first time I went out there with the director in a golf cart, he drove me out to this area where they had just reconstructed the sort of ghosts, if you will, of 4 structures that sat on a grid where enslaved people had lived. And when I got out to the site with its sort of interpretive signs, which you can see from on the left, the collection of trees that were standing there, I said to the director, "Do you know what these are?" And he said, "They're weeds." And I said, "These are black walnut trees. These are witness grandchildren and great-grandchildren of trees that had shaded people who had lived here, who were enslaved. They provided shade, they provided perhaps subsistence through black walnuts. But the reality is that they have a power of place and they have an authenticity, and we get to work with that authentic fabric to tell a story. So the question is, how do people know what they're looking at? And what are we doing to tell them beyond text and sign panels, beyond looking at a handheld device? What are the values? So if I were to step back for a moment to think about this conundrum today, if you will, the first thing I would do is I'd go back to Norman Newton and his essays on continuity and design when he taught at Harvard. This was an essay he wrote in 1950. And what he does here is he bemoans the siloization of the planning and landscape architecture disciplines at the GSD. He goes on to conclude that the separation of the professions in our schools of design carries out in our subsequent practice. This is the same period at the University of Michigan. You'll notice the student population here is all male. Fast forward 25 years, Ian McHarg, Design with Nature, and what we have with McHarg is we usher in ecological systems, the ecological view, the idea of overlays and analysis. What's fascinating to me is that when you go back and look at this work today, for example, the Staten Island Greenbelt, which is one of the major case studies in Design with Nature, you'll see there's no discussion of cultural lifeways or the Lenape Native peoples and their cultural lifeways. Completely absent from McHarg's analysis. And from this, the discipline moves forward. Earth Day, Jane Jacobs, ecological systems brings us to today. What about history and culture? Is that part of measuring success as we look at place stewardship and place making? It's hard to make decisions once you know what your values are, said Roy Disney. So in conclusion, a couple of thoughts. First is, I view landscapes like manuscripts, and the role of the landscape architect can be that of an expert editor. I mentioned these witness trees, and in our preparatory call for today, Krista mentioned this tree that had recently come down, the Gordon Hampton oak. And she also was nice enough to share with me the report that was done by Bartlett Tree Experts. This is a really well-written report about the tree and its condition, but clearly the scope of work didn't include any cultural value. How important, if you are an alum of the university, is it to maintain the authenticity and the connectivity of this living connective tissue? Should a campus like Stanford undertake a survey to assess what all of its heritage trees are and which of those trees have the most significant cultural value and stories to tell, and that those stories should continue through genetic propagation or other means so that we can have that tangible living connection with that landscape feature that contributes to the power of place. And Nick, I wanted to also, knowing because I'd be speaking to the Northern California chapter, I wanted to put up these images of the Weyerhaeuser campus, probably the greatest corporate office campus in the world. We had about 36 letters of experts around the globe proclaiming that we posted 6 months ago. We secured nearly a full page in the New York Times square foot column in the business section. Peter Walker, Renee Behan, Adam Greenspan, SOM, and others sat at the table for bi-weekly Section 106 compliance meetings. And what is going to happen here is we're going to evidence. So for example, if you look at the bottom right-hand side, those two warehouses, 1.5 million square feet of warehouses are going to be built here. They're going to create a puncture wound in one of the most important corporate office campuses, and the first to really deploy ecological systems and an attitude of laying lightly on the land with Charlie Bassett's structure lightly straddling the ravine. This is also a landscape associated with Native peoples and cultural lifeways. The Puyallup peoples have had freedom of movement here. There was a forester here for 40 years, healing the plant material, the trees, and you had two tremendous view sheds from the two interstates. All of this will probably become a situation where we have a significant amount of development, and what the preservation community is able to save is the building warehouse and the view to and from it. But the illusion of this building sitting in this natural landscape will be lost. Peter Walker has referred to this as his masterpiece of a 60-year career, and this landscape is going to be radically altered. Do we care? What should we be doing? If you were in a situation like this as a consultant, what would you do? Would you do a project like this? What would you do to change it? What are those values that you use to measure success? We've been given these renderings by the developer, and we've been told, let's pretend that it's actually going to look like this, these two warehouses that you see here. What we did is, through the generosity of SWA and PWP, and based on the available information, these renderings were created. Adam Greenspan told me this represents trees about 3 years after they were planting. And you can see on the right in a great way, the new warehouses. And on the left, you can see the new warehouses in relationship to the main structure. This will radically alter an internationally significant icon. And it's going to happen because we are not really forcing change in a way that we need to be much more engaged in the public arena. So to give you one other example of something that I think a lot about from the issue of context, which of course is the UN Plaza by Lawrence Halprin. It's not to say that the site is without its challenges in terms of its cultural lifeways today, but it is, along with Levi's and potentially the Valancourt, really the most extant fountains of Halprin's career. The idea of the animation of water, I believe, is central to the design of the fountain and to the choreography that Halprin was creating on Market Street, and the sort of score, if you will, that Halprin was creating between people and water and movement to the Beaux-Arts building. So when we look at a proposal, the question is, how do you measure success? To transform this into something that is far more static and has some of the extant fabric, but it doesn't have that quality of animation, I would ask you to say, how do you measure success? Is this a successful project as proposed? So in closing, I'll give you a couple of examples that I think are tremendously successful. And the first one is something that every time I go back to in Philadelphia, I'm inspired by it. And what's all the more remarkable is this was conceived during an era of urban renewal. This is Society Hill, one of the great districts of federal style architecture in America. And what was done here under Ed Bacon's vision, working with a variety of architects like Pei and Gergela and Collins, the landscape architect, a series of open spaces and networks were done to link back together the community through a comprehensive living and non-living palette. You can see in a handful of views here, whether it's the streetscapes, the furnishings, the ground plane, the insertion architecture, all of it is contributing to the whole in creating something that is symphonic. The insertions have weathered so well over the last number of decades that the historic district is now being revisited for the contributing aspect of these later additions. More recently on the West Coast, I am very excited when I see the work of Mia Lair. I know that she's one of the later speakers in your series, and the work she did with Fred Fisher at the Annenberg Beach House in Malibu. I'm a huge fan of the work that was done at Grand Park in Los Angeles to open this up, make it more porous, and breathe tremendous life into a former space, and still maintaining the key center of energy, the icon of that space. And I hope that Rios does the same with the two extant fountains of Lawrence Halprin's in Skyline Park, where they're currently working in Denver. And then finally, Governor's Island, the work of West 8, and taking this place that people did not have access, let alone 360-degree views of Manhattan and Staten Island and Brooklyn in a way that it was never available to the public. Created a transformative experience that grew out of a deep understanding of the evolution of that landscape. The last image on the bottom right, for example, the ice cream cone, shows you where the development went, how the landscaping was done to create that seduction, that fan dance, if you will, the reveal of the Statue of Liberty. And then actually taking the former bulkhead that had been destroyed during Hurricane Sandy and reappropriating it to create an extraordinary visitor experience to bring you to this high point and this view back to Lower Manhattan. In closing, I just want to also note the work of Reed Hildebrand with Doug Reed, who is a founding board member of the foundation, and a cheap plug for those of you going to ASLA, Cheekwood. The plan is on the top right, which is where we'll have our reception. And then finally, Nelson Birdwoltz. I'm just so pleased and honored every time I'm around Doug and Thomas, and their work inspires me in the way that they have great transparency, both displayed through the analysis and then the product of how those practices measure success and how core it is to their vision and values. I leave you finally with PV Plaza, one of the only occasions of twice that the foundation filed lawsuits. And we did this because the context told us that this was the birthplace of the Park Plaza, that it was a masterwork of M. Paul Friedberg, and we thought it was worthy of a transformation that was not tabula rasa. The resource was listed on the National Register in 2013, and I'm going to conclude with a photo that was taken by my colleague and friend Barrett Dougherty on Saturday, excuse me. This is PV Plaza today as rehabilitated by Shane Cohen, Linnea Tillett, James Garlanded Fluidity, and others. Note the young kids in the background who are literally walking on a scrim of water, honoring Friedberg's design intent for a reflective surface and for its animating qualities. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you for engaging us in such a reflective discussion of how do we blur these boundaries between nature, culture, history, and systems. And I feel like, you know, you asked this question so many, I didn't count how many times you asked during the presentation, but how do you measure success in your own work? And so I don't see any questions in the chat, but I would like to open this up as a discussion with the audience for how do you measure success in your work?
Are you asking me or the audience? I'm sorry.
The audience. If you have a response, you could start it off.
Well, I guess the thing I would say to start it off is as I scan across the people who you hear today, you know, in addition to Michael Boland, I see Doug Nelson. I see some people that if I were to use the word rehabilitation, hey, Doug, that they would immediately know exactly what I mean because they've done the kind of work with the Park Service and other agencies that is required through a Section 106 process to have certain outcomes where adverse effects are measured. But the reality is that rehabilitation, which is a technical word that the Park Service uses under the Secretary of the Interior, it's about managing change. And the only requirements in rehab is the idea of it being distinguishable, that someone knows that it's new, that it's being adapted. But one of the things about rehab is design. The fountain that I showed you for the Civic Center, for example, I could make a valid argument that it meets the standards for rehabilitation. The question is, does it succeed? And that's where the question of how everyone measures success is different. And so part of this, and part of what I think our roles and responsibilities are, especially today in our profession's quest to build a much bigger tent than we have in the past, that our challenge is to invite and engage, whether it's, in a community, those community-based stories in a meaningful way, or it's about research at the university level and fostering it at a staff level. The last thing I'm going to say before I shut up is, I don't know if anyone's here from SWA, but I was having a conversation with Renee Behan about a week ago about how the firm in this time has accommodated and encouraged a higher level of pro bono type work, to give back to the community. And one of the things that I would say as someone who was in the private sector for more than a decade, and I know that where we always lost money was on the research, that we always had to go deeper than the scope was going to allow. And it would be very challenging very often to go beyond the superficial if the budget wasn't there. So, we all have made those boards where a junior person in the office does some Google searching, they have some postcards, and they put together some stuff that is supposed to symbolize some kind of inspiration. But I would say to all of the landscape architects here today, we have to go deeper. The way in which we've made a commitment to go deep and wide on ecological systems, we need to do the same with cultural. And we need to foster it, and we need to nurture it, and we need to, especially for the young people, to open their eyes in practice, to give them the opportunity to have those acts of discovery and reflection.
Yeah, I agree. One of the questions that came up was, as we're coming out of this time of pandemic and looking around at all of the spaces that were used in new ways of bringing people and community together, whether it's closing down the street for yoga, how do we decide what is of historic significance, and what is the best way as landscape architects that we can document that?
Well, this whole idea that we get to decide, right? I mean, people always say to me, well, how do you choose how do you know what treatment it is? If we're going to spin some wheel, or there's some Ouija board that's going to kind of say, oh yeah, of course, it's going to be restoration. The thing is that program is so inherently tied to the question you've asked. And, my feeling is if you go deep and wide, a lot of the work is done for you by casting the widest net possible. The challenge is, how do those decisions meet with the mission and vision of the steward that you're working with? I gave a lecture in St. Louis a few weeks ago, and it was intriguing to me. I looked at the mission statements for St. Louis Parks, Kansas City Parks, and St. Joseph, Missouri Parks, and all three systems are historic. St. Joseph, Missouri, and St. Joseph, Missouri's mission statement actually recognizes its historic significance. The others are about doing as much as you can for recreation. It had other contemporary buzzwords around equity, but they were loosey-goosey and lacked clarity. And so I think one of the things that I would say in an ideal world is, to take on any project, you have to first start by knowing who you are as the client. And then if you're the landscape architect working with that client, then you have to understand how you work within that framework. So the question is kind of a tricky question about deciding, because I think part of this is it really depends on the charge as much as the knowledge that you've gained. But I think our job is to bring multiple systems values to the table. And that's why I asked the question of everyone's personal toolkits that they develop in measuring success.
Does anyone else in the audience have any additional questions they'd like to ask? But we have Charles here.
Yeah, I have a question, Krista. I'm not a plant. Charles, how much are you getting feedback or involved in the issue that the history we're trying to preserve maybe obliterated the prior history, or that it commemorates something that is not really popular now? Civil War monuments, we're having name changes of things. And sometimes the landscape architect that came in did a modern thing that obliterated what may be the real heritage of the site. Are you getting into that much these days?
Kathy, I don't think I have enough time to answer that question. There's so many ways to go depending on the site. I will say that, if I were to answer that very personally, I would say, for example, on the issue of monuments, that monuments have been really open in the last 5 years. I think of conversations that I had with Park Service colleagues that it may have seemed inconceivable that we would be where we are. And in terms of, for example, the events that just took place this past weekend in Charlottesville and Richmond, I wish I could have been standing there watching it happen, and I probably would have been brought to tears. I think that we're in a very complicated time right now. And I think that the important takeaway for me is that landscape architects have an incredibly important role to play in this moment as conveners, as facilitators. I'm going to tell a personal story. I was working on, as a answer your question, Kathy, because it really has to do with the charge we're being given and the questions that we ask.
Right.
So I was on the West 8 team last year. Some of you may have read in the news the fracas that had happened with a story that had come out of Rotterdam about a holiday party some years earlier. And I was on Adrian's team, and he said to me, I want you to give, this is in Baltimore, I'm sorry, along the Patapsco River. And he said, to kick off this project and to get everybody on the same page, I want you to give sort of a 20-30 minute overview of the history of parks and open spaces in Baltimore from their conception. And it was on Zoom, we're all remote. And I said, well, can I talk about race and equity? Now, I'll tell you that I worked on Druid Hill Park in Baltimore. When I was in the private sector, I was on the competition plan that won that. I worked on Mount Clair. I worked on the Patapsco Greenway. I thought I knew Baltimore history. I went back and I read the Olmsted Brothers reports. The first one is in the first decade of the 20th century. The second is 23 to 26. And the Olmsted say the parks are free and open for all. There it is, right? Then you're like, well, wait a minute. The city is segregated. So if you lived in Cherry Hill, which was the first community of formerly enslaved people living in Baltimore, you couldn't walk to the river's edge because there was parkland there. You couldn't go there. If you went to the Mount Clair golf course, where the signage of the federal style building and great signage along the water course that was like the Department of the Environment telling you all the bees and bunnies stories, that's great. There was nothing there about the protests that I read about between 37 and 39 of mixed race young people protesting segregated golf. The reality is that we as landscape architects can affect this work in a meaningful way. We can help to shape the vision and the values, and I pray beyond text and sign panels and plop art. We need to look at the opportunities by making visible we can have healing and reconciliation. This is an open process. It's not going to be something that's solved overnight. It's going to be emotional. It's going to be messy. It's going to be cathartic. It's going to be all the things that we as landscape architects are trained to do as public facilitators, orchestrators. It's what the great landscape architects in our history have done. And there are going to be minefields. There's going to be PR shit shows. There's going to be hurt feelings, but there will be healing. and we will grow. And I would just say that we have to be open and we have to be brave, and we have to be as collaborative as possible. And so I think when we get into the specifics are emotional. The last thing I'm going to say is I'm in my Google Analytics all the time, and it's been really interesting. The landscapes that have had monuments removed, like Lee Park in Dallas, are traffic generators on Google to my website. So, you know, there is a lot of clickbait and a lot of emotion that's driving that clickbait because our photos are from those monuments still reside on our website. So I think the prospects for us are enormous, but I'll also say, and I don't think I'm surprising anybody, we're a bunch of white people having this conversation today. So I'm so happy to see Michael Boland nodding. I will tell everyone that the course that I taught at the GSD this last semester, Michael was one of several dozen guest speakers, and do not miss his presentation. It was a privilege. I am such a tremendous fan of his work and the work happening at the Presidio today. It's an exemplar of the best work happening anywhere. And on this topic of diversity and looking at the long horizon line and thinking strategically and honestly about your question, Kathy, and it's ironic that you're both in my little boxes next to each other with him not. He's the dude. But again, it goes back to who he works with and the vision and values of that institution that is enabling, that's nurturing that work. That's where we have to get to.
And I think that ties in really well with our next question from Colette. What are some methods and strategies that you use to reach out to community members to learn more about sites, value, and history?
Gosh, for me, I would say it always starts with a site walk. I don't want to really, it's such an open-ended question like the prior one. There are so many different ways to answer that. I believe that landscape architects see the world in a unique way. I think that people that have worked in cultural landscapes have another series of lenses that they deploy on an everyday basis. We have this program now at the foundation called Walks and Talks, because we believe that landscape architects see the world in unique ways. So like this fall, over one weekend, we're gonna have walks and talks with ArcGeo and with West 8 and the work they're doing in Miami. But I have to say that one of the most fun things for me to do is to sort of parachute into a place, walk around it with fresh eyes in a community, and just start paintballing questions at people. Because, if we really, really look hard, the landscape will tell us its story. Think about this. We do this all the time with ecological systems. All of it. It's second nature for us. But really, for a lot of landscape architects, they're not looking at landscape as cultural fabric having a story to tell. And I've got to say, this is the moment, because the thing I will tell you is that people want to see the real thing. People want authentic. If you look at heritage tourism, if you look at, there's a lot of survey work to document this. So what's real? Krista, you're nodding. I think about our tree on the campus. And, to me, I don't think it was accidental that the tree was removed during COVID. I think because it was to diminish the emotional loss of that. But imagine if there was a much larger framed strategy to that tree that was about honoring it, that was about propagating it, that was about daylighting its story and what it means today to campus life and to other freshmen. So I just think that it's really about looking more closely and teaching people how to see. That's what it's about.
And we have one last question about looking more closely at certain sites. Evan from PGA Design will be working on the house documentation for UN and Embarcadero Plaza. Do you have any recommendations for how to document existing sites in a way that pushes for higher standards in future work?
Well, first of all, I want to say a shout out to PGA. You know, they've done really great house documentation on other projects like the Kaiser, which I know that building's been sold, so I'm not really sure what's going on there these days. But I think one of the questions about documentation, and I don't want to really open a hornet's nest, but I know that with Habs Hare House, there are archival standards that are established by the Library of Congress. And, you know, both of the spaces that you just mentioned have water features. And I think that the dynamics and the choreography of water are as important as the choreography of people. And so I think that one of the challenges there is to be thinking about how we document the animating qualities of a Halprin design. Because normally, you know, Habs Hare House are photographs. They're static, there's no movement. And so, you know, for Lawrence Halprin, who had a process for motation and for doing scores, choreography and movement might be something to think about in terms of pushing the traditional house envelope.
Great, thank you for sharing that insight. That wraps up our time today. And so we just want to give another big round of applause and thank you so much for coming to our chapter and sharing such great thoughts and ideas about how we can make a difference in our community and find value and success in our work. So thank you.
Krista, thank you to you and Todd in the chapter, and congratulations on a great lineup. I'm glad I didn't have to follow the others.
Thanks for being here.
Okay, bye now.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.